The blood-soaked snow around Grace Armstrong formed a crimson halo as she drifted in and out of consciousness, each labored breath creating small clouds that dissipated into the frigid Montana air of 1876. Her once beautiful face was now swollen beyond recognition, her delicate fingers broken from trying to defend herself against the savage beating she had received at the hands of men she had trusted. As darkness threatened to consume her entirely, the sound of approaching hoofbeats penetrated her fading awareness, either death coming to claim her or salvation arriving just in time. Beau Northcott pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he guided his horse through the deepening snow. The temperature had dropped considerably in the last hour, and the rancher knew he needed to reach shelter before the blizzard hit in full force. He'd spent the day tracking a mountain lion that had been attacking his cattle, and now he was paying the price for venturing so far from his homestead. "Easy there, Thunder," he murmured to his stallion as the horse suddenly became agitated, snorting and stamping in the snow. Beau narrowed his eyes against the swirling white, trying to discern what had spooked his usually steady mount. That's when he saw a splash of dark red against the pristine white landscape just off the trail. Dismounting with practiced ease, Beau approached cautiously, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. What he found made his blood run cold despite the biting wind. A woman lay crumpled in the snow, her clothes torn, her face bloodied, and her body so still that for a moment he thought he was too late. "Madam," he called, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" A faint moan escaped her lips, and Beau felt a surge of relief. She was alive barely, but alive nonetheless. With gentle hands, he brushed the blood-matted blonde hair from her face, wincing at the severity of her injuries. Whoever had done this had meant for her to die out here, alone and forgotten. "I'm going to help you," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "You're going to be all right." Beau knew the nearest town, Silverpine, was at least 10 miles away, and his own ranch was even further. With the storm closing in, he had no choice but to try to make it to town. Removing his coat, he carefully wrapped it around the woman's battered body before lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, or perhaps it was just the surge of protective fury that made her weight seem insignificant. Securing her to his saddle, Beau mounted behind her, cradling her broken form against his chest. "Hold on," he whispered into her ear. "Just hold on." As they set off into the worsening storm, Beau had no way of knowing that this woman, this stranger he had found at death's door, would change the course of his life forever. All he knew was that each minute that passed was another minute she might slip away. And so he urged Thunder forward, beginning a desperate 10-mile journey through the unforgiving Montana wilderness. Grace drifted through a haze of pain and disjointed memories. The sensation of warmth against her back contrasted sharply with the icy needles stinging her face. She couldn't open her eyes, they felt swollen shut, but she could hear the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and feel strong arms holding her upright. "Stay with me," a deep voice urged, somewhere close to her ear. "We're going to make it." She wanted to respond, to ask who he was and where they were going, but her lips wouldn't form the words. Instead, she focused on the one thing she could control: breathing. Each inhale sent daggers of pain through her ribs, but she forced herself to continue, clinging to consciousness with the tenacity that had defined her 24 years of life. Beau felt the woman in his arms shudder, and he tightened his grip, trying to shield her from the worst of the wind. The blizzard had descended in full force now, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of them. Thunder struggled through snow that was rapidly deepening, and Beau knew they were losing precious time. "Come on, boy," he encouraged his horse. "Just a little farther." In truth, They had covered less than 3 miles, and Beau was beginning to fear they wouldn't make it to Silver Pine before nightfall. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and the woman needed medical attention soon. Her breathing had become more labored, each exhale a painful gasp that tore at Beau's heart. He thought of the trapper's cabin he knew was somewhere to the east, not as good as town, but it would provide shelter and a chance to tend to her wounds. Making a quick decision, Beau veered Thunder off the trail, heading toward where he hoped the cabin would be. "Change of plans," he said to the semi-conscious woman. "We're going to find somewhere to wait out this storm, get you warmed up." It was nearly an hour later when the dark outline of the cabin finally appeared through the curtain of snow. Beau had never been so relieved to see a dilapidated structure in his life. Dismounting carefully, he carried the woman to the door, praying it wasn't locked. The wooden door swung open with a creak, revealing a single room with a small fireplace, a narrow bed, and basic supplies. Laying her gently on the bed, Beau quickly set about lighting a fire. His fingers were numb with cold, making the simple task difficult, but finally, a small flame took hold. As the cabin slowly began to warm, he turned his attention back to his charge. In the flickering firelight, he could better assess the extent of her injuries. Her face was a mass of bruises, one eye swollen completely shut. Her lips were split in multiple places, and dried blood crusted around her nose and mouth. When he carefully removed his coat from around her, he saw that her dress was torn and stained with both blood and dirt. "What kind of animal does this to a woman?" he muttered, anger building in his chest. Beau found a bucket and ventured outside to collect snow to melt for water. While the fire worked its magic on the frozen precipitation, he searched the cabin for anything that might help. In a trunk near the bed, he discovered some old but clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey, and a threadbare blanket. "This will have to do," he said, returning to the woman's side. Grace felt gentle hands cleaning her face, the sting of alcohol on her cuts bringing her closer to full consciousness. She struggled to open her eyes, managing only to crack the lid of her right one. A blurry figure leaned over her, his features gradually coming into focus, a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble, concerned blue eyes, and dark hair that fell across his forehead. "There you are," he said softly when he noticed her looking at him. "Thought I might be losing you for a while there." "Who?" She croaked, her voice barely audible. "Name's Beau Northcott," he replied, dipping a cloth in clean water before continuing to bathe her wounds. "Found you out in the snow about 4 hours ago. We're in a trapper's cabin waiting out the storm." "Grace," she managed to whisper. "Grace Armstrong." "Well, Miss Armstrong, you've had a rough time of it, but you're safe now," Beau assured her. "Can you tell me who did this to you?" Grace tried to speak again, but was overcome by a fit of coughing that sent waves of agony through her chest. Beau quickly supported her, holding a cup of water to her lips. "Easy now," he said. "No need to talk just yet. Rest is what you need." As she sipped the water, Grace's mind cleared enough to remember snippets of what had happened. The Wells brothers had convinced her to invest in their mining venture. When she discovered they were swindling her and other townspeople, they had taken her for a ride to discuss the matter. The discussion had turned violent when she'd threatened to go to the sheriff. "The Wells," she whispered. "Thomas and James Wells." Beau's expression darkened. "The Wells brothers did this. I know of them. They've been causing trouble all over the territory." Grace nodded weakly, the small movement sending fresh pain shooting through her skull. "They'll pay for this," Beau promised, his voice low and dangerous. "But first, we need to get you well again." He continued tending to her injuries, cleaning each cut and bruise with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. When it came time to check for broken bones, he hesitated. "Miss Armstrong, I need to examine your ribs and such, but I don't want to. That is, it wouldn't be proper without." Despite her pain, Grace felt a hint of amusement at his discomfort. "Mr. Northcott, I believe propriety is the least of my concerns at the moment. Please do what you must." With careful hands, Beau felt along her sides, apologizing each time she winced. "2, maybe 3 broken ribs," he diagnosed. "And your left wrist is definitely broken. I'll need to bind these." Using strips torn from the cloths he'd found, Beau created makeshift bandages and splints. By the time he finished, Grace was exhausted but more comfortable than she'd been since regaining consciousness. "You should try to sleep," Beau said, tucking the blanket around her. "I'll keep the fire going." "Thank you," Grace whispered, her eyelid already drooping, "for saving my life." As she drifted off to sleep, Beau settled himself on the floor near the fire, his back against the wall and his eyes on the woman in the bed. He'd been on his way home from a cattle sale when he'd found her, a fortunate coincidence that had placed him on that particular trail at that particular time. Or perhaps it wasn't coincidence at all. Beau wasn't a superstitious man, but as he watched Grace Armstrong sleep, her battered face somehow still beautiful in the gentle firelight, he couldn't help but feel that something larger than himself had guided him to her. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would forever alter the course of 2 lives that had collided in the wild Montana wilderness. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the cabin's single window. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine white landscape and an eerie silence. Beau, who had dozed only fitfully while keeping watch, rose stiffly from his position on the floor and checked on his patient. Grace's color looked better, though the bruises on her face had darkened to deep purple. Her breathing seemed easier, and when he touched her forehead, he was relieved to find no sign of fever. She stirred at his touch, her good eye fluttering open. "Good morning," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," she replied, her voice stronger than the previous night. "But I'm alive, thanks to you." Beau smiled, unexpectedly charmed by her spirit. "Hungry? I've got some jerky and hardtack in my saddlebags." "Not exactly a feast, but it'll keep our strength up." "That sounds wonderful," Grace said, attempting to sit up before gasping in pain. "Whoa there," Beau said, quickly moving to support her. "Let me help you." With gentle hands, he eased her into a sitting position, propping her up with his rolled-up coat. Their faces were close for a moment, and Beau found himself noticing the flecks of gold in her green eyes, or at least in the one that wasn't swollen shut. Clearing his throat, he stepped back. "I'll just, fetch that food." While Beau retrieved the provisions from his saddlebags and checked on Thunder, Grace took stock of her situation. Her entire body ached, but her mind was clear now. She remembered everything the Wells brothers' scheme, her confrontation with them, and the brutal beating that followed. They had taken her money, her dignity, and nearly her life, but they hadn't succeeded. She was alive, and she was determined to see justice done. First, though, she needed to heal. When Beau returned, they shared a simple meal. Grace couldn't manage much, but the food and water revived her somewhat. "Mr. Northcott." "Beau, please." "Beau," she corrected with a small smile that pulled at her split lip. "I need to get to Silver Pine as soon as possible. The Wells brothers need to be stopped before they hurt anyone else." Beau's expression grew serious. "Miss Armstrong, Grace," she interrupted, and he nodded. "Grace, then, you're in no condition to travel yet. Those ribs need time to start healing, and we need to get that wrist properly set. Besides," he added, glancing out the window, "the snow's about 3 feet deep out there. We won't be going anywhere for at least a day or 2. Grace wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Even sitting up had exhausted her. The thought of enduring hours on horseback through deep snow was unimaginable. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked. "We stay here. Let you regain your strength," Beau replied. "I'll hunt some fresh meat, see if I can find anything else useful in this cabin. And you can tell me everything about the Wells brothers and their scheme, so when we do get to Silverpine, we're prepared." Grace nodded slowly, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "That's reasonable, but I warn you, it's not a pleasant story." "Few worth telling are," Beau said, his blue eyes meeting hers with an understanding that suggested he had his own unpleasant stories to tell. Over the next hours, as Beau tended the fire and prepared a rabbit he'd snared not far from the cabin, Grace told him about the Wells brothers. They had arrived in Silverpine 6 months earlier, charming and full of big ideas. They'd claimed to have discovered a rich silver vein in the mountains and were selling shares in their mining company. Grace, who ran a small but successful dressmaking business in town, had invested a substantial portion of her savings. "I should have known better," she said bitterly. "But they had documents, samples of ore. Everything seemed legitimate, and Thomas, he was attentive." She looked away, embarrassed. "I thought perhaps his interest in me was genuine. I was a fool." "You weren't the only one they fooled," Beau said, turning the rabbit on the makeshift spit he'd constructed. "The Wells brothers have pulled similar schemes all over Montana and Wyoming. They're wanted in at least 3 counties that I know of." "How do you know so much about them?" Grace asked. Beau's expression darkened. "They tried the same game at a town near my ranch last year. My friend Owen lost everything. His wife left him, took their children back east. Owen. He couldn't live with the shame. Shot himself 3 months ago." Grace's good eye widened. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," Beau said, his jaw tight with restrained emotion. "But it's why I recognized their names right away. I've been hoping to cross paths with those vermin someday." "And now you have, in a way," Grace said softly. Their eyes met across the small cabin, and something passed between them, a shared purpose, a connection forged in pain and injustice. In that moment, they became more than strangers thrown together by circumstance. They became allies. The day passed slowly. Beau ventured out to care for Thunder and to gather more firewood, while Grace drifted in and out of sleep. Her body was beginning the long process of healing, and exhaustion claimed her frequently. Each time she woke, though, Beau was there, offering water or food or simply a reassuring presence. As night fell again, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that the small fire couldn't entirely dispel, Beau noticed Grace shivering despite the blanket. "You need more warmth," he said, concerned. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her chattering teeth betrayed her. Beau hesitated, then made a decision. "Forgive me for being forward, but there's only one way to keep warm enough through the night. Body heat." Grace looked at him, surprise evident on her face. "Mr. Northcott, are you suggesting nothing improper?" he hastened to assure her. "Just sharing the bed fully clothed for warmth. I promise to be a gentleman." Grace considered his offer. Under normal circumstances, she would never entertain such an idea. But these were hardly normal circumstances, and she trusted this man who had already saved her life once. "All right," she agreed softly. "But you must promise to tell no one when we return to civilization. My reputation is precarious enough as an unmarried businesswoman." "You have my word," Beau said solemnly. With as much dignity as possible, they arranged themselves on the narrow bed bow on the outside, creating a barrier between Grace and the cold room, careful not to put pressure on her injured ribs or wrist. There was no way to avoid contact on the small mattress, and Grace found herself enveloped in the clean, masculine scent of him. "Comfortable?" he asked, his voice a rumble she could feel through his chest. "As much as possible," she replied, hyper-aware of their proximity. Good night, then, Grace Armstrong. Good night, Beau Northcott. Despite the awkwardness of their situation, Grace felt safer than she had in months. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, or perhaps it was the solid presence of the man beside her, but she fell into a deep, healing sleep, free from the nightmares she had expected. Beau, however, lay awake much longer, acutely conscious of the woman sleeping trustingly in his arms. He had lived alone since returning from the war 8 years ago, avoiding entanglements and focusing solely on building his ranch. Now, in the space of a day, this brave, battered woman had somehow breached the carefully constructed walls around his heart. As he finally drifted off to sleep, his last thought was a vow to see her healed, to bring the Wells brothers to justice, and then he would see what might be possible between them. The next morning brought warmer temperatures and the beginnings of a thaw. Beau woke first, careful not to disturb Grace as he slipped from the bed. Looking down at her sleeping form, he was struck by how peaceful she appeared despite her injuries. In sleep, the tension had left her features, making her look younger, more vulnerable. Moving quietly, he rebuilt the fire and stepped outside to check the conditions. The sun was bright in a clear blue sky, and though the snow was still deep, it had begun to compact. With luck, they might be able to travel the following day. When he returned to the cabin, Grace was awake and attempting to fix her hair with her good hand. "Here, let me help," Beau offered, surprising himself. He'd never braided a woman's hair before, but he'd seen his mother do it countless times when he was a boy. Grace hesitated, then handed him the ribbon she'd salvaged from her torn dress. "Thank you. It's difficult with just one hand." Beau stood behind her, his fingers gentle as he combed through her tangled golden hair with improvised care. Despite its unwashed state, it was still silky to the touch. He worked slowly, aware of her wincing when he accidentally pulled too hard. "I apologize," he said. "I'm not very skilled at this." "You're doing fine," she assured him, "better than I could manage on my own." As he worked, a comfortable silence fell between them. It was strange, Beau thought, how natural this felt, caring for her, being in this small space together. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so at ease with another person. "There," he said finally, tying off the simple braid. "Not the fanciest work, but it'll keep your hair out of your face." "Thank you," Grace said, reaching back to feel his handiwork. Her fingers brushed against his, and a current seemed to pass between them at the contact. Clearing his throat, Beau stepped away. "The weather's improving. If it continues like this, we should be able to make it to Silver Pine tomorrow." "Good," Grace said, though her tone held a note of something that might have been regret. "I need to speak with Sheriff Davis as soon as possible." "You think the Wells brothers are still in town?" Beau asked, returning to the practical matter at hand. Grace shook her head, then grimaced at the pain the movement caused. "No. They said they were leaving for Helena after they were done with me, but they may not have gotten far in the storm." Beau's hands clenched into fists at the casual way she referenced her own assault. "We'll find them," he promised, "one way or another." They spent the day preparing for the journey ahead. Beau reinforced Grace's splints and helped her practice sitting upright for longer periods. Her strength was returning gradually, though she was still weak and in considerable pain. "Tell me about your ranch," Grace said as they shared the last of the rabbit stew that afternoon. "How long have you had it?" Beau's face lightened at the question. 8 years now. Bought it with my Army pay after the war. It wasn't much at first, just a run-down cabin and 100 acres of overgrazed land. But I've built it up, bit by bit. Now I've got over 500 acres, a proper house, and one of the best herds of Hereford cattle in the territory." "You sound proud of it," Grace observed, smiling at his enthusiasm. "I am," Beau admitted. After what I saw in the war, all I wanted was a peaceful place of my own, somewhere to build something good." "I understand that feeling," Grace said softly. "That's why I started my dressmaking business. I wanted to create beautiful things to make women feel special when they wore my designs." "How did you learn to sew?" Beau asked, genuinely interested. "My mother taught me. She was a seamstress for a fine lady back east. When she died, I was 16. I took over her position, but the lady's husband was not a gentleman." Grace's expression darkened. "I left in the middle of the night with $20 and my mother's sewing kit, made my way west, working in shops until I had saved enough to open my own establishment." "That took courage," Beau said, admiration clear in his voice. Grace shrugged, then winced at the movement. "It was survive or perish, not much of a choice." "Still," Beau insisted, "many would have accepted a bad situation. You chose to forge your own path." Their eyes met, and Grace felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. This man saw her not just as a victim to be rescued, but as a person of strength and determination. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her that way. As the day waned, they once again faced the question of sleeping arrangements. Without discussion, they assumed the same positions as the previous night, though there was less awkwardness this time. Grace found herself drawing comfort from Beau's solid presence at her back, his arm a protective weight across her waist, carefully positioned to avoid her injured ribs. "Beau," she said softly into the darkness. He responded, his voice thick with approaching sleep. "Thank you. Not just for saving me, but for treating me like a person worth saving." Behind her, Beau was suddenly fully awake, struck by the vulnerability in her words. "Grace, you are worth saving. Don't ever doubt that." She didn't respond, but her hand found his where it rested at her waist, and their fingers intertwined. It was a small gesture, but in it was the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for when fate had thrown them together in the snow. Dawn broke clear and cold, the third day since Beau had found Grace bleeding in the snow. They rose early, both aware of the journey ahead. Grace was moving more easily now, though her ribs still caused her considerable pain, and her face remained a mosaic of purple and yellow bruises. "Are you certain you're strong enough for this?" Beau asked as he helped her into his coat. "I have to be," she replied with determination. "Every hour that passes is another hour the Wells brothers have to escape justice." Beau nodded, understanding her resolve. "We'll take it slow. It's about 7 miles to Silverpine from here, and the trail should be passable now." After a meager breakfast of the last of their provisions, Beau carefully helped Grace onto Thunder's back before mounting behind her. The arrangement was intimate by necessity. He needed to hold her securely to prevent her from being jostled too much on the uneven trail. As they set off, Grace leaned back against Beau's chest, drawing strength from his steady presence. The pain in her ribs was considerable, but she gritted her teeth against it, focusing instead on the beauty of the snow-covered landscape and the warmth of the man behind her. They rode in companionable silence for the first few miles, stopping occasionally to rest both horse and rider. During one such stop, as Beau helped Grace down from the saddle, their faces came close together, and for a charged moment it seemed as though he might kiss her. But the moment passed, and Beau stepped back, a flush visible beneath his weathered complexion. "We should be in Silverpine by mid-afternoon," he said, his voice gruffer than usual. "What will you do after?" Grace asked, suddenly concerned about what would happen once they reached town. "Will you return to your ranch?" Beau's blue eyes met hers steadily. "Not until the Wells brothers are brought to justice. I made a promise to you, and I intend to keep it." Relief flooded through Grace, though she chided herself for it. This man owed her nothing. He had already saved her life, cared for her wounds, and was now escorting her safely to town. Yet the thought of facing what lay ahead without him by her side filled her with dread. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to fully express her gratitude. The rest of their journey passed without incident, the miles disappearing beneath thunder's steady gait. As Beau had predicted, the outskirts of Silver Pine came into view in the early afternoon, the town's buildings a welcome sight after days in the wilderness. "We should go directly to the doctor," Beau said as they approached the main street. "No, the sheriff's office first," Grace insisted. "Every moment counts if we're to catch the Wells brothers." Beau wanted to argue but recognized the determination in her voice. "All right, but the doctor immediately after." They drew curious stares as they rode down Silver Pine's main street. A battered woman and a rugged stranger sharing a horse was not a common sight, even in a frontier town accustomed to unusual occurrences. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, several townspeople had gathered to watch. Sheriff Davis was a weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He was on his feet immediately when Beau carried Grace into his office. "Miss Armstrong, good Lord, what happened to you?" "The Wells brothers," Grace replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "They beat me and left me to die in the snow 3 days ago. Mr. Northcott found me and saved my life." The sheriff's expression darkened as he listened to Grace's account of the Wells brothers' scheme and her subsequent assault. When she finished, he shook his head grimly. "Those two have been nothing but trouble since they arrived. I had my suspicions about their mining venture, but no proof until now." He looked at Grace's battered face. "They won't get away with this, Miss Armstrong. I'll send telegrams to every town within 100 miles. We'll catch them." "I want to help," Beau said, his voice firm. "I have personal reasons for wanting to see these men brought to justice." Sheriff Davis assessed the tall rancher with a calculating gaze. "You're Northcott, aren't you? Own that big spread near Wolf Creek?" Beau nodded, surprised to be recognized. "Heard good things about you," the sheriff continued. "I could use a man with your skills. I'm organizing a posse to go after the Wells brothers first thing tomorrow. You're welcome to join." "I'll be there," Beau promised. With the immediate business concluded, Beau insisted on taking Grace to the doctor. Dr. Willard's examination confirmed what Beau had already diagnosed: 3 broken ribs, a broken wrist, and extensive bruising. The doctor set the wrist properly and bound her ribs more securely than Beau had been able to manage. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Armstrong," Dr. Willard said as he finished his ministrations. "Whoever found you likely saved your life." Grace's eyes sought Beau's across the room. "I know," she said softly. The question of where Grace would stay that night was answered when Mrs. Haggerty, the town's boarding house proprietor, appeared at the doctor's office, alerted by the town's efficient gossip network. "You'll stay with me, of course," the motherly woman declared, brooking no argument. "I've prepared my best room for you." Beau, who had remained by Grace's side throughout the doctor's examination, now found himself at a loss. The intimacy they had shared in the cabin seemed a world away from the reality of town life with its rules and proprieties. "I should find a room at the hotel," he said awkwardly as they prepared to leave the doctor's office. "Nonsense," Mrs. Haggerty interjected. "I've room for you as well, Mr. Northcott. Any man who would carry a woman 10 miles through a blizzard deserves a comfortable bed and a hot meal, at the very least." And so it was arranged. Beau would stay at the boarding house, joining the posse in the morning, while Grace recovered under Mrs. Haggerty's watchful eye. That evening, after a hearty meal that neither of them could fully appreciate despite their days of meager provisions, they found themselves alone on the boarding house's small back porch. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant against the black sky. "It feels strange," Grace said, drawing Beau's coat, which she had continued to wear tighter around her shoulders. "Being back among people after everything." "I know what you mean," Beau replied, leaning against the porch railing. "I've gotten used to my own company these past years. Being on the ranch, it's just me and the hands most of the time, but it was different with you in the cabin." Grace looked at him, surprised by his candor. "Different how?" Beau met her gaze, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. It felt natural, like we'd known each other for years instead of days. "I felt that too," Grace admitted softly. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Beau took a step toward her, his intention clear in his eyes. But before he could close the distance, the back door opened and Mrs. Haggerty appeared. "There you are, Miss Armstrong. You should be resting, not catching your death out here in the cold. And Mr. Northcott, Sheriff Davis, is in the parlor looking for you." The moment broken, Beau stepped back, nodding to the older woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Haggerty. I'll go speak with him." As he passed Grace, he paused, his hand briefly touching hers. "We'll talk more when I return," he promised quietly. Grace watched him go, a mixture of anticipation and fear churning in her stomach. In the space of 3 days, this man had become important to her in a way no one had been before. Tomorrow he would ride out with the posse, facing danger on her behalf. The thought filled her with dread. Inside, Sheriff Davis had assembled a group of 5 men, including Beau, to pursue the Wells brothers. Intelligence suggested the swindlers had indeed headed toward Helena but were delayed by the storm. With luck, the posse would intercept them before they reached the territorial capital. "We ride at first light," the sheriff announced. "Pack for several days. These men are dangerous, as Miss Armstrong can attest. They won't be taken without a fight." Beau nodded grimly, his mind already preparing for the pursuit. But beneath his focus on the task ahead, a more personal concern nagged at him: what would happen after? When the Wells brothers were captured and justice served, would he and Grace go their separate ways? The thought was surprisingly painful. Later that night, as he lay in the unfamiliar comfort of a proper bed, Beau found himself missing the close quarters of the trapper's cabin and the warm presence of Grace beside him. Something had begun between them in those snow-bound days, something fragile yet promising. Whatever happened with the Wells brothers, Beau knew he couldn't simply ride away when it was over. Not without discovering what that promise might hold. Dawn broke cold and clear as the posse gathered in front of the sheriff's office. Beau checked Thunder's saddle one final time, his mind divided between the task ahead and the woman he was leaving behind. He had tried to see Grace before departing, but Mrs. Haggerty had informed him that she was still sleeping, her body demanding rest to heal. "You'll look after her?" he asked the boarding house keeper. "As if she were my own daughter," Mrs. Haggerty assured him. "You just focus on catching those villains and coming back safely." With a nod of thanks, Beau mounted Thunder and joined the other men. Sheriff Davis had mapped out their route based on the most likely path the Wells brothers would have taken toward Helena. If they rode hard, they might intercept the fugitives before they crossed the county line. As the posse rode out of town, Beau felt eyes on him and turned to see Grace standing on the boarding house porch, wrapped in a blanket against the morning chill. Their eyes met across the distance, and Beau raised his hand in a gesture that was part farewell, part promise. She returned the gesture, her face pale but determined in the early light. Then they were past the town limits, and Silverpine disappeared behind them as the posse set off on the trail of the men who had nearly killed Grace Armstrong. For 2 days, they followed the signs of the Wells brothers' passage campfire remains, tracks partially obscured by melting snow, and reports from homesteaders who had seen two men matching their description. The trail led them into increasingly rugged country, the mountains rising steep and forbidding on either side. "They're heading for Blackwater Pass," Sheriff Davis said on the evening of the second day as they made camp. "If they get through it, they could disappear into any number of mining camps on the other side. We'll catch them before then," Beau said with quiet confidence. The pursuit had awakened something primal in him, a protective fury that drove him forward despite exhaustion and the bitter cold of the mountain nights. On the morning of the third day, their persistence was rewarded. As they approached a narrow defile leading to Blackwater Pass, one of the men spotted fresh tracks in the muddy ground. "Can't be more than a few hours ahead of us," the sheriff observed. "We'll catch them before nightfall." He was right. As the afternoon waned, they crested a rise and saw two riders moving slowly along the trail below, their horses clearly tired from the hard journey. Even at a distance, Beau recognized them from Grace's descriptions: Thomas and James Wells, the men who had beaten her and left her to die. "There they are," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Sheriff Davis signaled the posse to spread out, cutting off any possible escape routes. Then, with practiced precision, they closed in on their quarry. The Wells brothers didn't surrender easily. When they realized they were trapped, they abandoned their horses and took cover behind a rocky outcropping, guns drawn. "Give it up, Wells," Sheriff Davis called. "You're surrounded." "Go to hell, Sheriff," came the reply, followed by a shot that whined past the lawman's head. The standoff lasted nearly an hour, with sporadic gunfire exchanged but no decisive advantage gained by either side. As daylight began to fade, Beau grew increasingly concerned. If night fell before the brothers were captured, they might slip away in the darkness. Taking a calculated risk, Beau worked his way around the rocks, approaching the Wells' position from an angle they weren't watching. When he was within 20 yards, he made his move, darting from cover to cover until he was nearly upon them. Thomas Wells saw him first and swung his gun around, but Beau was faster. His first shot caught Thomas in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his weapon. James, distracted by his brother's cry of pain, was a second too slow in responding. Beau's second shot didn't miss either, striking James in the leg and taking him down. "It's over," Beau shouted, his gun trained on the wounded men. "Throw down your weapons." With their injuries and their position compromised, the Wells brothers had no choice but to surrender. As Sheriff Davis and the others closed in to secure the prisoners, Beau stood over the men who had nearly killed Grace. "Why?" he demanded, his voice cold with fury. "Why did you beat her and leave her to die?" Thomas Wells, clutching his bleeding shoulder, glared up at Beau with hatred. "The bitch was going to expose our operation. She found out the mine was empty, threatened to go to the sheriff." "So you thought you'd silence her permanently," Beau said, his finger tightening on the trigger of his gun. "Northcott," Sheriff Davis said warningly, placing a hand on Beau's arm. "We've got them. Justice will be served." For a moment, Beau considered ignoring the sheriff's implied command. It would be so easy to end these men right here, to avenge not only Grace but also his friend Owen. But then he thought of Grace, her strength, her determination to see proper justice done. She wouldn't want him to become a killer on her behalf. Slowly, Beau lowered his gun. "Get them on their horses," he said grimly. "Let's take them back to face what they've done." The return journey to Silverpine took another 2 days, the pace slowed by the need to tend to the Wells brothers' wounds and keep them secure. Beau rode in grim silence for much of the way, his thoughts increasingly turning to Grace and what awaited him upon their return. He had joined the posse to see justice done, but also to prove something to himself and perhaps to her. that he could be the man she needed, the protector she deserved. But now, with that mission accomplished, uncertainty crept in. What place could he have in her life once this was over? Grace's recovery progressed slowly, but steadily under Mrs. Haggerty's attentive care. By the 5th day after the posse's departure, she was able to move around the boarding house with minimal assistance, though her ribs still pained her, and her wrist remained splinted. News of the Wells brothers' capture reached Silver Pine ahead of the posse, carried by a rider dispatched by Sheriff Davis. The town buzzed with excitement, and Grace found herself the center of attention as people stopped by the boarding house to express their sympathy and admiration. "You're quite the heroine," Mrs. Haggerty observed as she poured tea for Grace in the parlor, "standing up to those scoundrels, surviving what they did to you." "I don't feel like a heroine," Grace replied honestly. "I feel lucky that Mr. Northcott found me when he did." Mrs. Haggerty's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Ah, yes, you're Mr. Northcott, a fine man by all accounts, and quite taken with you if I'm any judge." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I hardly know him," she protested weakly. "Sometimes it doesn't take long to know what matters," the older woman said wisely. "I knew my Harold was the one after just 3 days in his company." Before Grace could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Looking through the window, they saw the posse riding down the main street, the Wells brothers bound and mounted on weary horses. "They're back," Grace whispered, her heart suddenly pounding. Her eyes scanned the group, seeking one rider in particular. And there he was, Beau Northcott, tall in the saddle, his face weathered from days on the trail but his posture unbowed. As if sensing her gaze, he looked toward the boarding house, and even at a distance, the connection between them was palpable. Grace moved to the door, ignoring Mrs. Haggerty's admonition to rest. She needed to see him, to thank him, to reassure herself that he was truly back and unharmed. By the time she reached the street, a crowd had gathered around the returning posse. The Wells brothers were being led, limping and defeated, toward the jail. Sheriff Davis was addressing the onlookers, explaining that the brothers would stand trial for fraud, assault, and attempted murder. And then Beau was there, dismounting from Thunder and pushing through the crowd toward her. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain. "You're back," Grace said simply, unable to find more eloquent words. "I promised I would be," Beau replied, his eyes never leaving hers. Around them, the crowd continued to mill about, but neither noticed. In that moment, it was as if they were alone again in the trapper's cabin, the rest of the world fading to insignificance. How are your injuries?" Beau asked, noting that she still moved gingerly. "Healing," Grace assured him. "Dr. Willard says I'm making excellent progress." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with all the things they had yet to say to each other. Finally, Beau spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I need to speak with you privately, when things settle down." Grace nodded, relief washing over her. "Come to the boarding house this evening. Mrs. Haggerty has a small garden out back where we can talk undisturbed." With that arrangement made, they parted, Beau to stable Thunder and report to the sheriff, Grace to return to the boarding house and prepare herself for whatever the evening might bring. As dusk fell over Silver Pine, Grace waited in Mrs. Haggerty's garden, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. The garden was simple but charming, with early spring flowers just beginning to bloom along neatly kept paths. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, the measured tread she had come to recognize during their days together. Turning, she found Beau approaching, freshly shaved and wearing clean clothes, though his rugged appearance remained fundamentally unchanged. "You look better," she observed with a small smile. "As do you," he returned, Noting the improved color in her cheeks and the fact that she could now open both eyes, though one was still surrounded by fading bruises. They stood facing each other, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Finally, Beau took a deep breath. "Grace, I need to ask what your plans are now. Will you stay in Silver Pine?" The directness of the question surprised her. I haven't decided. My business is here, but after everything that's happened." She trailed off, uncertain. "What about you? Will you return to your ranch?" "I should," Beau acknowledged. "Spring calving will be starting soon, and my foreman can't handle everything alone." Disappointment settled in Grace's chest. Of course he would leave. He had responsibilities, a life to return to. What had she expected? But Beau wasn't finished. "However, I find myself reluctant to go, or rather reluctant to go alone." Grace's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Beau stepped closer, his expression earnest. "I know this may seem sudden. We've only known each other a short time, but these past days, what I feel for you." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Grace, I've been alone a long time. Never thought I'd want it any other way, but then I found you in the snow and everything changed." Heart racing, Grace met his gaze steadily. "For me as well," she admitted softly. "You saved more than my life, Beau. You reminded me that there are good men in this world, men worth trusting with my heart." Encouraged by her words, Beau took her hands gently in his. "I'm not asking for promises right now. Just a chance. Come to Wolf Creek with me when you're well enough to travel. Stay at my ranch as my guest for a time. If you find you don't like it, or that your feelings change, I'll bring you back to Silver Pine or wherever you wish to go." The offer was generous and honorable, like the man himself. Grace considered it carefully. Her business in Silver Pine could be sold or perhaps even relocated, and after her ordeal, the idea of a fresh start was appealing. But more than that, the prospect of more time with Beau, of discovering where these new feelings might lead, was irresistible. "Yes," she said finally, her voice firm with decision. "I'll come to Wolf Creek with you." The smile that lit Beau's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Without further hesitation, he leaned down and kissed her gently at first, mindful of her healing injuries, then with growing passion as she responded eagerly to his embrace. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Grace found herself laughing softly. "What is it?" Beau asked, his arms still around her waist. "Just thinking about how this all began with me half dead in the snow and you carrying me 10 miles to safety. Not exactly the romantic beginning most couples dream of." "Perhaps not," Beau agreed, smiling down at her. "But it's our beginning, and I wouldn't change it. Every step of those 10 miles brought me closer to you." In the weeks that followed, Grace's recovery continued steadily. The Wells brothers were transported to Helena for trial, where they would face charges not only for their crimes against Grace, but also for similar schemes perpetrated across the territory. Justice, long delayed, was finally being served. Grace sold her dressmaking shop to her assistant, a talented young woman who had worked alongside her for the past 2 years. The decision was bittersweet, but Grace found herself looking forward to the new chapter that awaited her. 3 weeks after the Wells brothers' capture, she and Beau set out for his ranch near Wolf Creek. The journey was taken in easy stages, with frequent stops to ensure Grace's still healing body wasn't overtaxed. Beau was attentive throughout, his care for her comfort and well-being evident in every decision he made. Wolf Creek Ranch, when they finally arrived, took Grace's breath away. Nestled in a verdant valley with mountains rising majestically in the distance, the property was larger and more developed than she had imagined. The main house, though not grand, was solid and well built, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. "It's beautiful," she said as Beau helped her down from the wagon they had traveled in for the final leg of their journey. "It's home," Beau replied simply, a note of pride in his voice. "Or at least, I hope it will be." The underlying question in his statement was clear, but Grace wasn't ready to answer it yet. Despite their growing feelings for each other, she needed time to be sure to know that what they had built during their ordeal could flourish under normal circumstances. Beau had prepared for her arrival with touching thoughtfulness. The guest room was bright and airy, with fresh curtains and a handmade quilt on the bed. He had even hired a housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, a widow from Wolf Creek, to ensure Grace's comfort and to maintain proprieties. Life on the ranch quickly established its own rhythm. Beau was busy from dawn to dusk with spring calving and the 1,000 other tasks that running a successful cattle operation entailed. Grace, as her strength returned, began to find her own place in this new world. She discovered that her skills as a dressmaker transferred well to other domestic arts. Soon, she was helping Mrs. Fletcher with the cooking and household management, adding touches of beauty and comfort to the functional bachelor home Beau had maintained. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Sometimes they talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. Other times they simply sat in companionable silence, content with each other's presence. Their courtship progressed with deliberate care. Beau was unfailingly respectful of Grace's boundaries, never presuming or pushing beyond what she was ready for. But the attraction between them grew stronger with each passing day, their kisses becoming more passionate, their embraces more difficult to end. 1 month after their arrival at Wolf Creek Ranch, Beau took Grace on a picnic to his favorite spot on the property, a small meadow beside a clear running stream, where wildflowers carpeted the ground in vibrant colors. As they sat on a blanket, enjoying the simple meal they had brought, Grace found herself studying Beau's profile. The strong line of his jaw, the hint of gray at his temples, the laugh lines around his eyes. She had come to love every detail of his face. "What are you thinking?" Beau asked, catching her gaze. "That I'm happy," Grace replied honestly. "Happier than I ever expected to be after everything." Beau reached for her hand, his expression serious. "Grace, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart began to race, somehow knowing what was coming. "These past weeks have been the best of my life," Beau continued. "Having you here, seeing you every day. I can't imagine going back to the way things were before. I don't want to." He shifted to face her fully, still holding her hand in his. "I know it hasn't been long by conventional standards. But I think what we've shared, the circumstances that brought us together, have given us insights into each other that most couples take years to develop." Taking a deep breath, Beau reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Grace Armstrong, I love you. Will you marry me?" Opening the box revealed a simple but beautiful ring, a single pearl set in gold, elegant and understated. Grace stared at the ring, tears welling in her eyes. She had known this moment might come, had even hoped for it, but now that it was here, emotions overwhelmed her. "Beau, she began, then paused to collect herself. "When those men left me in the snow, I thought my life was over. I never imagined that what seemed like an ending would actually be a beginning, the beginning of us." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears and something else, a deep, abiding love that had grown from the seeds of gratitude and admiration into something magnificent and enduring. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, I will marry you." The joy that suffused Beau's face was answer enough, but he sealed their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and protection. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Wolf Creek's small church. The entire community turned out for the event, ranchers and townsfolk alike, all curious to meet the woman who had captured Beau Northcott's heart after so many years of bachelorhood. Sheriff Davis made the journey from Silverpine to attend, bringing news that the Wells brothers had been convicted and sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. The chapter of Grace's life that had begun with violence and fear was truly closed now, justice having been served. Standing before the altar in a dress she had made herself ivory silk with delicate lace trim, Grace felt none of the uncertainty that might have been expected from a bride who had known her groom for such a short time. In the crucible of their shared ordeal, something rare and precious had been forged between them, a bond that transcended conventional courtship. "I, Beau, take you, Grace, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady and sure as he slipped the pearl ring onto her finger. "To love and to cherish, to protect and to honor, all the days of my life." When Grace repeated her vows, her voice was equally certain. This man had carried her 10 miles through a blizzard to save her life. She would walk beside him for the rest of their days, their journey together just beginning. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges to the Northcott family. Grace's dressmaking skills found new life in Wolf Creek, where she established a small business that quickly gained popularity among the town's ladies. Beau's ranch continued to prosper under his careful management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. Their first child, a son they named Owen in memory of Beau's friend, arrived a year after their wedding. A daughter, Margaret, followed 2 years later, and eventually a second son, William, completed their family. On winter evenings, when the snow piled deep around the ranch house and the wind howled across the Montana plains, Beau and Grace would often tell their children the story of how they met, though the more frightening details were softened for young ears. "Your father carried me 10 miles through a blizzard," Grace would say, her eyes meeting Beau's across the warm kitchen. "He saved my life." "And your mother saved mine," Beau would invariably reply, just in a different way. On one such evening, as their 20th wedding anniversary approached, Beau found Grace standing on the porch, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. The years had been kind to her, her blonde hair now threaded with silver, her face lined with the marks of laughter and life, but still beautiful to him. Coming up behind her, Beau wrapped his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against him with a contented sigh. "Remembering?" he asked softly. "Always," she replied. "It's strange to think that the worst day of my life led to everything good that followed." Beau tightened his embrace, thinking of all they had built together over the years. The ranch now expanded to over 1,000 acres, their children growing into fine young adults, the community they had helped shape. "I've never regretted a single step of those 10 miles, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Even when I thought you might not make it, even when my own strength was failing, every step brought me closer to this life with you." Grace turned in his arms, her green eyes still bright and clear after all these years, meeting his with a love that had only deepened with time. "And I've never regretted saying yes," she replied. "Not for a single moment." Their lips met in a kiss that held the warmth of 2 decades of shared life, yet still contained the spark of the passion that had first drawn them together. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, but inside the home they had built, all was warmth and light and love, the enduring legacy of a rescue that had saved them both. In the grand tapestry of the American West, theirs was just one story among many of courage and resilience, of darkness overcome by light, of love found in the most unexpected circumstances. But to Beau and Grace Northcott, It was everything, the foundation upon which they had built a life of extraordinary, ordinary happiness, one day at a time, together. And when spring came again, as it always did, they would stand together on their porch and watch the snow retreat from the valley, revealing the green promise of new beginnings. And they would remember that even in the coldest, darkest moments, hope can survive just as Grace had survived, just as their love had flourished from the most unlikely of beginnings. For in the end, it wasn't just that Beau had carried Grace 10 miles to safety. It was that together, they had journeyed much farther through decades of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges, always supporting each other, always finding their way forward, always coming home to the love that had saved them both on that snowy day so long ago.